Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the IPS-Nathan Lecture series by Dr. Shawn Lam, our 18th S.R.Nathan Fellow for the Study of Singapore. Today, Dr. Lam will be delivering his first lecture titled Singapore Biodiversity and a Thriving City. Following his lecture, Dr. Lam will take questions from the audience in a Q&A session. The Q&A session will be chaired by Ms. Audrey Tan, Assistant News Editor at the Straits Times. Before we begin, please allow me to go over some housekeeping rules for the event. Thank you for joining us at the auditorium today. Please be reminded to switch your mobile phones to silent mode. The lecture is being streamed live on Facebook. It will also be recorded and uploaded onto our IPS website and social media platforms later. Please submit your comments and questions at any time during the lecture through the Facebook comments. For our audience members here at the auditorium today, please step up to the mic stand during the Q&A session to ask your questions. We would also like to hear your views on the event. There will be a link in the feed and a QR code at the end of the lecture, which you can click on to submit your feedback. Director of IPS, Janadas Devon, will now deliver his opening remarks. Director, please.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the 18th IPS-Nathan Lecture. Our 18th S.R. Nathan Fellow for the Study of Singapore is Dr. Shawn Lam, Senior Lecturer at the Asian School of Environment, Nanyang Technological University. Trained as a biologist and ecologist, Dr. Lam has devoted much of his academic career to studying the resilience and long-term viability of fragmented and disturbed forest remnants, work that is especially salient in highly urbanized landscapes such as ours. Beyond academia, Dr. Lam has long been active in the conservation community. He served the Nature Society for decades, including as vice president and president. He has worked closely with academic institutions, government agencies, NGOs, and schools, and continues to advise on biodiversity and environmental management. It is therefore fitting that Dr. Lam lecture series examines the place of nature in Singapore's development journey. Singapore has transformed itself, we like to boast, from a garden city into what we now describe as a city in nature. This evolution presents an enduring paradox. In a land-scarce nation, conserving diversity and protecting green spaces can compete with pressing economic and other needs. At the same time, a city with diminished nature may well become less livable and less resilient. In today's lecture, Singapore Biodiversity in a Thriving City, Dr. Lam will examine the state of biodiversity in Singapore and explore how we might reconcile these competing narratives or imperatives. The second lecture will turn to the relationship between nature and society, consider how biodiversity shapes human well-being and social outcomes. The third and final lecture will widen the lens to Singapore's regional and global role, asking how a small state might play a role in advancing conservation beyond its shores. I would like to thank Ms. Audrey Tan, Assistant News Editor for Environment at the Straits Times, for moderating today's Q&A. Her extensive experience covering environmental issues for Straits Times will greatly enrich our discussion. The S.R. Nathan Fellow, the full title is S.R. Nathan Fellowship for the Study of Singapore, was established in 2014 to pay tribute to our sixth and hitherto longest-serving president, the late Mr. S.R. Nathan. The fellowship aims to promote greater discourse on Singapore's public policy and current affairs. We raised around close to $6 million, including a matching grant from the government, to endow this fellowship. I would like to thank individuals as well as corporations, including those who give to IPS annually as part of the Corporate Associates Program, for their support and generosity in funding this fellowship and supporting IPS. To conclude, I wish to thank Dr. Lam in particular for accepting this role as our 18th S.R. Nathan Fellow. He's unusual. He's not the same as all the other fellows we've had. We've had bankers recently, presidents of NUS, and and Philip Yeo, and so he's quite different. And I'm sure a refreshing change judging from the crowd that turned up to hear him. His scholarship, civic engagement, and long-standing commitment to biodiversity make him uniquely placed to guide us through these important questions. Welcome.
Thank you, Director. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Shawn Lam to begin his first lecture titled Singapore Biodiversity and a Thriving City. Dr. Lam, please.
Thank you, Kai-Sin, and thank you so much to all of you who've turned up on a Monday afternoon to attend this lecture. I see quite a number of familiar faces, old friends, but also many who I've meeting for the first time, which I think is a very good thing, because I think with these talks, we don't want to speak to the same audience talk after talk after talk. And the hope is that today, or this series of 3 lectures, will allow people. I don't claim to be, have the final word on the fate of biodiversity, what we should do, but I do hope that we can, through these lectures and these conversations that we'll have after each lecture, begin to start conversations across sectors to see how nature contributes to making Singapore a better place, a more resilient society, and a society that is not only happier, but also is prepared then to do its part on a much larger stage, which I know we're capable of doing. Now, when Kai-Sin contacted me about 1.5 years ago to say that she wanted to arrange for me to speak to Mr. Janadas about the S.R. Nathan lecture, I thought maybe you were going to ask me, do I have any recommendations for the fellow? And little did I know, when I spoke to Mr. Janadas, I was speechless, and anybody who's ever spent any time with me before knows that I'm never speechless. So this is the one time. One thing I must say about the IPS, though, when Kai-Sin told me there was a dress code today, so I won't say I'm like the biblical figure, Old Testament figure Samson, who had his locks cut, but it does feel a bit unusual to be attired in this way. So anyway, I just brought like my comfort blanket here. So okay, all right, thank you. Okay. Okay, so let's. I'm so honored, delighted, happy, overjoyed, humbled to be here at the same podium that so many of my own heroes have stood at, whether that was Prof. Wong Gong Wu, or Prof. Chan Hing Chi, Prof. Joseph Liao, Prof. Lily Kong, just so many, Ms. Nolene Heiser, Mr. Piyush Gupta, Mr. Philip Yeo, Mr. Ravi Menon, oh my God, and a wonderful colleague of mine from civil society, Ms. Corina Lim. So to be counted among their number is humbling beyond measure. What I hope to do, if I've managed to do what I hope to do at the end of these talks, I do hope that I'll be able to demonstrate that nature is not really about just nature. It's really about people, and thriving societies have thriving nature, and vice versa. Nature is central to everything we do and to life as we know it, but then the question is, can we internalize that and act on it? So we may know it in our heads, but do we feel it in our hearts and then work with our hands to make these things happen? I believe Singapore can contribute to that global conversation and action. So again, I do think that nature-related policy, oh, by the way, did I tell you I'm not a policy expert, but I'm going to try my best, that it should address the biodiversity crisis, it should link to the climate crisis, it should really lead to better outcomes for people, not just for the plants and animals, the birds and the butterflies and everything, but for communities, creating meaningful opportunities, many benefits beyond what people call ecosystem services, which I'll talk about next month in the second lecture. And then it will create, as Mr. Janadas said, resilient, livable, and I should add, lovable cities, states, and nations. So again, lecture 2, which is next month, will deal with the social element, the social good that nature can bring to communities and to countries. And third, I do like to think we're a small country, but we have big levers that we can pull to the benefit of not just our own community, but global humanity. I mean, it sounds pretty grim at the moment, given what's happening in the world around us. And you might think, well, biodiversity, does it really matter when people are doing what they're doing to each other at the moment? But I think, you know, just like if you leave your house, think of all the small little tiny infrastructural repairs. You put that off, you're busy, you've got things to do, and then before you know it, the infrastructure's no good, your home is not livable, and it's disastrous beyond words. And I think maybe looking after the environment is the same way. We really need to look after it, even though it doesn't at the moment seem like an imperative. So I hope to show in these next few weeks that, next 2 months, sorry, that it is an imperative. We can do it, and we're perfectly capable of achieving these goals. Okay, very quickly, Singapore, a city in nature. We have people like Dr. Lena Chan, who is one of the most important biodiversity people with us. Maybe she would be better placed to explain this. But we started with the Garden City 60 years ago, and in Mr. Lee Kuan Yew's words, the creating of the Garden City was not just to make the city nice and green. It really had a strategic value. The strategic value, essentially, and here's his words at the bottom, was to see if there's a way of demonstrating that this Singapore was a country, a newly found and under very, you know, uncertain circumstances, that it was a place worth believing in and investing in. And the Garden City, the well-kept greenery, well-managed landscape, was just a manifestation of a society that could be counted on to do things right. And over the years, of course, many of you have undertaken tree planting long before the Million Trees Initiative. But then in 2012, we went from a garden city to a city in a garden. But that initiative would last less than a decade, because we essentially went from city in a garden to city in nature. We have lots of biodiversity. As you can see on the right, 300 birds, more than 300 butterflies. We have unbelievable, but 1/3 of the world's corals, hard corals, are found in our murky waters, which is, I think that's incredible. 2,000 species of plants all around us, yet many of us can live our whole lives unaware of this rich diversity, this heritage that we have literally on our doorstep. So now, if I may very quickly summarize, sorry, this is kind of like the sciencey talk, but I promise I'll get to other issues shortly. But in a wider context, we have a crisis on our hands, the biodiversity crisis and its twin, the climate crisis. They're both interrelated, although the climate crisis gets a little bit more of the headlines. But the briefest of overviews. Here we go. So we know that every year now it turns out to be either the warmest or one of the warmest on record. I don't even need to point to this graph. You can just see the annual temperatures rising and rising without, look at that, every year really is like the hottest year. Not only that, though, this is the biodiversity side of it. This report, United Nations report released in 2019, showed that within our lifetimes, and not just young people's lifetimes, but even everyone in here lifetimes, we may lose not just thousands, literally over 1 million species are in imminent danger of disappearing. But not just the fact that we lose the species, but we would lose their contributions to making these earth systems, these life-supporting earth systems viable. So that's a real danger. It really is. Birds are in decline. 1/3 face imminent extinction. The Living Planet report, which is done by WWF, and I'm happy we have the former chair of the WWF Singapore board, Mr. Joseph Koh, here. But the Living Planet report that the WWF puts together, which tracks about 500 species, 5,000 different populations, have shown that since 1970, and that I was 7 years old in 1970. 5,000 species and almost 40,000 populations. The numbers are down by about 70% compared to 1970. Now, there's some contention over how this figure is derived, but the point is there's a lot less wildlife around in the world today than even the youngest of us in this audience when we were born. So, I mean, that's the kind of crisis. And again, it's not the species. They contribute to marine ecosystems that feed people, terrestrial ecosystems that regulate the planet, that provide, again, many of these these vital, essential services. Now, there is, so I see the word policy in there. There is an international policy framework. This is under the CBD, Convention on Biodiversity, which was, as you know, dates back to 1992, the Convention on Biodiversity, and was chaired by a Singaporean, the founder, one of the founders of the Institute Policy Studies, Professor Tommy Koh, in Rio de Janeiro in 1992. But the latest kind of iteration of this is what's called the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. I won't elaborate too much, but it basically shows how we can conserve species, we can share benefits that derive from nature, that we can actually share information. Again, Dr. Lena Chan, who's seated kind of in the middle of the lecture theater, was involved very much in some of these negotiations. So maybe we can ask you afterwards, Lena. But there are a few interesting things here that I should mention. So for example, within these targets, and I have to thank the Nasri for this slide, there is something called the 30 by 30, which is by 2030, the goal is to try to ensure that 30% of the world's ecosystems are protected and 30% of the world's degraded habitats are restored. It's 2026. And so it's going to be a tall task. But and then the other major thing to come out of this framework is somebody has to pay for this. And it's going to be billions of dollars. And who amongst both the family of nations as well as the corporate sector and private sector, how can we come up with the package that will get countries to the point where they can protect all of this? Okay, so now in the next 3 minutes, 200 years. I have to thank, I mean, I just kind of made this up, but you're looking at 200 years ago, maybe Bukit Batok looked like that, Sinming was like that, Sembawang was like that, Hougang Central was like that. But actually, Sinming, this is actually quite close to Sinming because this is off the Mekrichi Nature Trail, and this is in the Singapore Botanic Gardens rainforest, which is right next to the Dalvey Estate. So imagine, where you live now was a rainforest. There were tigers, elephants, leopards, all kinds of wildlife that you may have only seen in a zoo, but it was walking around right where you live. Well, each of us, all of us, live. And that's really incredible, this transformation of the landscape. I thank Tonio Dempsey for these slides. So if you watch the changes over time, and the things to look out for would be this lime green, I think rainforest. Pink is what I call freshwater swamps. There's this other darker green, mangroves. So if you look at the changes within 50 years of the founding of the British trading colony here in Singapore, over 90% of the natural habitats had already been cleared. So it was for agriculture, for plantation agriculture. So the destruction or land use change was really due to agriculture, not so much because of urbanization. It was much later that the urbanization would come. And in this slide, Tony, and you have to like the graphics too. He's got coconut. I think, did I show the sea monster? There was a sea monster somewhere in there, but okay. This is the late 19th century, so a little bit more than 100 years ago. Plantations everywhere, and the red mark what were the forest reserves. But many of these, like the Pandan Reserve, the Kranji Reserve, they were set aside really to be used for firewood, charcoal, right, for mangrove resources. And the rainforest reserves, sorry, too excited. Rainforest reserves really were in the central part of the island. Only a few of these, and Changi as well. Okay, this is the early 20th century. Still lots of coconut plantations, rubber plantations, and still a fair amount of mangrove, but come today, that's where we're at. So we're at fractions of a percent. This is based on a study by Gaw and Yo and Dan Richards as well. But again, you can see that there's very little of that original habitat around. Although what's left is beautiful, like Bukitima, the Labrador Nature Reserve, Sungai Buloh, and so on. But again, imagine that some of these things, particularly loss of habitat, loss of habitat, hunting, intensive agriculture that created this land use change were the primary drivers of this species loss. Now, we do have, and the narrative is, we have high diversity, which is true, that we continue to find new discoveries, surprising things, even known only from Singapore. That's also true and something to be proud of. But the narrative is a little bit more nuanced. We have suffered great losses of biodiversity, as you would expect when you shrink habitats, and we will continue to have losses. That's, I think, inevitable. But we do have a lot of these invasive species, which sometimes they come on their own, but sometimes it's through a little bit of sloppiness, or not sloppiness, but we let them pass through. They come in horticultural shipments, for example. You know, so there are things that we can do here to tighten this up. This got us on the map for biodiversity, but it's not a very pleasant headline, is it? Catastrophic extinctions. This is a 2003 paper by Barry Brook from Australia and the late Navjot Sodhi and Peter Ng from NUS. And essentially what they did was they looked at how many species were collected in Singapore and described, and how many are left. But what they also tried to calculate was the fact that when systematic collections began in Singapore, this is the 1870s, there had already been 90% habitat loss. So the reasoning was, if there probably were things that we lost before they could ever be collected in the first place. So they did a bit of hand waving, and I thought I'd explain this, not because I'm kind of a science geek, but I think this is kind of interesting logic. So what they said was, well, what's the highest possible number of species that we could have in Singapore? And the highest possible, let's look at the lowland fauna and flora of Malaysia and put that into the equations. And when you do that, you get to these frightening figures of 90% extinctions, or 70, 80%, where the actual ones here in the dark bars. Now, if I fast forward to what Ryan Chisholm recently has done at NUS, he's a mathematical genius and came up with his students and postdocs a more nuanced mathematical sampling that I think gives us a better estimate. And in fact, what was reassuring was the likely extinctions are not that far off from the actual extinctions. So I think that was, so we're in the 30%, 40%. That's still a lot of extinctions. That's still a lot of magnificent species that once walked, I can't say walked our streets, walked where our streets are today, more like that. Now, we have had some forest reserves, but many of these have been since turned into industrial estates in the case of Jurong or Pandan, or military complex in the case of Changi. But on the other hand, we have the central catchment, that big green space in the middle of the island, which was once agricultural. So in some ways, you could argue that we have more contiguous green space than we've had in 100 years, even though some of those peripheral green spaces have been disappearing. So now, 5 minutes of basic conservation science, and I'm sorry, the sciencey part will finish in a minute, but this is one concept. It's called succession. So the wonderful thing about Singapore is that these tropical habitats, any habitat really, but in the tropics in particular, if you don't cut the grass, it turns into a forest. That's what happens. So if, for example, this Bukit Timah campus, if we just gave the grass cutters a break for a few years, we'll come back to what's called a secondary forest. There's a whole group of species. Now, this is a North American example, but there's a whole group of species that are called pioneers. They disperse well, grow fast, need a lot of light, and they will colonize an open space and create a forest. Again, any green space that's just left alone will turn into a forest, which is why, for example, even behind Takashimaya, Ngee City, there's a forest where once was just an open grassy space because the birds just bring the seeds. But then what happens in this succession process is that if there is a nearby source, longer lived, shade requiring, larger seeded, what are called late successional species arrive. And so that means if you find this succession happening, it's not just that the plants are there, it also means that animals are moving around the landscape, because tropical plants require animals to disperse seeds. Typically, when we interpret these secondary forests, we just look at the plant species composition, forgetting that there is an ecology behind that. The presence of plants means animals are there doing their job. So that's now this thing called island biogeography. So I'll bring your attention to two names. This is the late Robert MacArthur, this great Princeton early theoretical ecologist, and his collaborator Edward Wilson, who went on to become probably the most influential whole organism biologists, of the 20th century. They found this general relationship that if you have these are islands in the area of an island and the number of species. And whether it's birds or ants, you basically have this relationship, and there's a mathematical relationship too. As the islands get larger, the species diversity gets higher. I mean, that's common sense, really. But they were able to show that, I guess the point here is that if you reduce an island size by 90%, you typically can expect to have half the number of species. So it's not linear. So if you have a habitat that's 1% of the original, it still should have 25% of the original diversity by this relationship. So that's been an important part of the conservation toolkit, managing nature areas and planning and spacing them around and seeing how to connect them. So I'll leave this island biogeography for the moment. Now, there's another thing, and let me just skip these slides here. But essentially, that just means if you have, think of a nature reserve as an island. It's exactly what it is. It's an island of green in a sea of development. And so if you have a small nature area, which is a small island, it tends to actually lose species much more quickly than a large nature reserve. That's just the basic how this works. And if you have a nearby source, so if you say the Bukit campus, we're not too far from, say, McRitchie or Bukit itself, whereas where I work, which is closer to Malaysia than it is to Bukit it's very far from a forest that can then send the seeds over. So what you would find is if you're in a nearby, a small nature reserve close to another nature reserve, you can expect to find higher dispersal of seeds from these mature rainforests than if you were very far away. So there's a distance effect and a size effect. And I think I'll come back to that later. So Bukit is a 1.6 square kilometer remnant of forest. This is a Tony O'Dempsey photo too. Thank you, Tony. I forgot to ask permission. This is a swamp forest, freshwater swamp, highly critically threatened habitat. Very small piece of it left up near the Upper Silitar, Upper Pierce reservoirs. It's a beautiful place. Beautiful place. And then we have these other regenerating forests, of which there's a lot. This is the southern ridges. This is the Mount Faber Telok Blangah Hill area, which I think they're reopening this beautiful forest walk again soon. And then we have our central catchment, which is a mix of primary and secondary forests. You can actually, oops, did I shoot you, somebody with the laser? I'm sorry. You can actually see the uneven canopy, that's primary forest, and that flat, even canopy is secondary forest. Even after 160 years of protection, you can see that the primary forest hasn't really spread very much into that secondary forest. So forest recovery is extremely slow, or can be extremely slow, and that's a problem that we really need to overcome. And to show you again, this is a map, another map from Tony. The dark green represent patches of primary forest. You can see some are fairly large, like around McRitchie or Bukit and some are really tiny. Some are really tiny. The larger ones, like Bukit or these pieces in McRitchie, tend to have very good regeneration. Everything you see up in the canopy, you can see seedlings of them down on the forest floor. However, some of these very small ones, which my colleague at NUS, Chua Siu Chin, and her team have looked at, you have these beautiful canopy giants, but then you look in the understory and they're not regenerating. they're maybe too isolated, or there's something which she's investigating. So all these tiny little patches, if Siu-Chin's initial studies are consistent, they're all kind of in need of help. And we missed this. She found it, which is to her credit. Again, to show you that Bukit-Timah, based on its size, should be able to fit about 25% of Singapore's original flora and fauna, whereas the central catchment should be about able to contain half, which is not bad. 30 square kilometers out of an original area of 550, that small piece, because of these relationships of size and area, can still hold substantial biodiversity. And I think we can actually increase that number. We can increase that number. So now, very quickly about how we manage these, and again, I have many colleagues from the national parks here who are better placed to answer these than I am. So for example, there's something called the Forest Restoration Action Plan. And this is at the Rifle Range Nature Park. And it shows you they have methods of regenerating the forest. They can help it out through something called assisted natural regeneration. Basically, there's a playbook for it, and national parks have been doing what is also being done in other places. I think we got much expertise and support from specialists in Australia and Thailand who are very good at this. I'll come back to this in a minute. And sometimes, wildlife can surprise you. So if you went to Colombo, for example, in the capital of Sri Lanka, it actually has a thriving population of what are called fishing cats. These are very elusive nocturnal cats that use the system of waterways. They go under roads and they weave throughout their city. So sometimes you can find a surprisingly rich diversity in cities. I mean, we have the otters and everything. That was surprising too. You have, if you watch those David Attenborough films, you might see that there are leopards or tigers too on the outskirts of some of these cities. Really incredible. So it's not impossible to have what you might consider very wild wildlife living next to you in cities, although that also has its own share of concerns, right? What are called human-wildlife conflicts. And I'll get to that in a second. No, I'll get to it right now. And I'm proud to say that Mr. Prof. Sivasoti here, the Otterman himself, you can't miss him because he's wearing an orange cap in the third row. But he to imagine, because we used to go out together, he collecting his otter data for his master's degree, and I'm collecting plants. I don't know, Siva, if you actually saw an otter during your master's. You were collecting their poop, but, right? In Penang, yes, right? So you could study otters for 2 years and not see them because they were so rare. It's not because Siva was lazy. He was an extremely hardworking biologist, but they were just scarce. But today, you can go almost anywhere, really, if you go often enough to a waterway, you will. I live in Whampoa. I've seen otters in my neighborhood, and it's as urban can be, and yet there are otters there. So they've come back, and it's a real wonderful success story. But of course, there's a flip side to it, and this is, conflict. Now you think, okay, how bad is this? If you have elephants come and raid your garden, that's terrible. That's dangerous, and it can ruin livelihoods. I can see how people get upset over these kinds of things and want authorities to do something. And then the wild boar. Again, it's not funny when you're attacked by a wild boar. It really can be, they can do a lot of damage. And so how do you coexist with nature when in fact sometimes nature can actually, be dangerous in a real way? Then of course there's these kinds of, probably one of the most hated birds in Singapore, I'm very sad to say. This is the Asian coel. And I think I have a recording of it. Let's see if I can find it. Yeah. Woo-hoo! Right. I mean, okay. People hate this. It keeps them awake, or wakes them up very early in the morning. But did you know, if you went to Sri Lanka, to hear this bird is like a good omen? It's a sign of the new year coming. It brings joy. And I checked it, I double-checked, because I wrote to a PhD from our department who's from Sri Lanka. I said, tell me, Tarak, is it really true that you like the sound of a koel? He said, oh yes, it brings much happiness and joy. Another thing is if you sometimes hear like a house crow, which again, with another reveled bird that causes revulsion and anger, if you hear that in a village, it actually suggests that maybe somebody you have not seen in a long time is coming to visit you. And he is a scientist, a PhD scientist, and he has confirmed that people have visited him within a day or two of hearing a house crow. So how much more empirical proof does one need? Okay. But, the other thing is, these are miracles of nature, right? Because the koel is a parasite. So here are koel chicks that have been laid, the mother koel laid the eggs in the crow nest, and the crow raised the imposter as one of its own. So that's already quite remarkable. The second thing is, then how come the koel does not get imprinted and want to mate, settle down with a crow? It actually doesn't. It finds another koel. So there's some amazing things going on in the wiring of a koel, which I think boggles the imagination and is yet another thing to celebrate. Yet I feel bad sometimes that all we can think about is how noisy these things are, and maybe we should cut down the trees in front of our house because then the koels won't roost anymore. So I think in this case is, I'll show another slide later, but in some cases, if you have elephants destroying crops, big cats taking livestock, that's a safety issue and a livelihood issue. So sometimes it is a wildlife problem, but sometimes it could be also in part a people problem. So how then do you reconcile these two? Very quickly about marine environments, look at this beautiful intertidal coral reef habitat. You won't believe, I'm going to zoom out now, and you see this is going into the harbor. This is Sentosa with some of the southern islands, and they're going into the Pasir Panjang port. Our waters, as busy as they are, support an incredible range. 1/3 of the world's hard coral species, that's far more corals than the Caribbean in our modest local waters. And another miraculous thing, this is seagrass. These are the Enhalus, the ribbon seagrass. These are female flowers, what look like little styrofoam balls. These are actually male flowers. They're released and they skim around on the surface, really zip around really quickly. The slightest wind will propel them forward. And what happens is then the little male flowers get sucked into the vortex and then pollinate the female flower at the surface of the water. It's a real incredible thing to watch. And I know I've heard Professor Peter Ng tell me when he was a teenager, he used to go out to Changi and wade through just acres of seagrass. Again, those of you in the finance sector would be very interested to know that seagrass and mangroves store a huge amount of carbon under these seagrass meadows, far more than even terrestrial forests. So in terms of this, carbon financing, green finance, all of these, they're referred to as blue carbon, and it really, is something that policymakers are kind of thinking about. How do you kind of bring these ecosystems into these financial systems? Now, here, this is Tony O'Dempsey's wonderful map again, shows you some of these intertidal mudflats, sandy areas. Some of you will remember the East Coast being this incredible habitat where the sand at low tide would just stretch out forever, and there'd be marine life and fishing villages. Of course, if you weren't born in the 50s or earlier, you might not remember this. And that's one of the topics that oh no, I gave away the answer. Oh, yeah, man. Okay, so there's 3 roads. One is called Telok Kurau Road. Another one is Jalan Raja Udang over near Balestier, and the third one is Jalan Belangkas off of McPherson. I was going to ask, can you mix and match them, but somebody already has. But Raja Udang is a kingfisher. Belangkas is a horseshoe crab. And the kurao is the threadfin fish. To think that, maybe a couple of generations ago, there would have been, no matter what ethnicity you were, you would have known what's a kurao, what's a blancas. It's just, that's the vernacular. And yet, just 2 generations later, most of us, it's just another foreign word for many of us. And I think that's kind of a loss of the cultural connection to this land which we grow up in. And I think that's a very sad thing. I think it makes us a poorer society in that sense, not in a literal sense. Now I just wanted to go for a few minutes on what are called shifting baselines. So sometimes it's called the extinction of experience. Every generation sees a little bit less than what the previous generation saw. So what becomes kind of acceptable, the bar just goes lower and lower and lower over time. So I just tried to think of, well, were there shifting baselines near where I stay? So here's 10 years of the PIE near the Hongka, what is now the Tenga town. So this is the old Jurong Road, The PIE is right here. This is 2009, 15 years ago. And if you watch over time, 2015, 2021, you see the forest is starting to go. 2023, 2024, they're building roads across an MRT. And if you went there today, there's 2 years later, right, 2026, it's even more built up. I've taken students on field trips across this stretch of PIE every year, and I notice the changes, but every new group of students who come into NTU don't know what was there before. So for them, this could have been there forever, but it's only been in the past few years. That's what I mean by shifting baselines or the extinction of experience. Here's another one. I think this one is Bukit Batok Road, around the same area, the other side of that, Tengah. And again, I'm not saying that we should not build housing or anything, but it just shows you how we are our brains are very good at adapting to changes in the landscape, so we kind of forget what was there. So if you look from 2009, 2021, and there it is today. Right? And again, a child born today will never imagine that there was anything other than dense housing estate. Now, dense housing estates are very good, and we need them. But again, how do you reconcile that changing landscape and the experience you have with wild spaces, even in the midst of all of this change? I think it's a very challenging, both from the terms of from policy, from how we teach young people, how we engage people across generations. Okay, not to belabor the point, no pun intended, but this is near the Labor Foundation, Thompson Road. Here's 2008, and if you look, now watch what happens to the hill. Some of you may remember there was a hill. So over the years, this is going to be the North-South Expressway is running under this, right? And there we go, 2023. So that's quite a bit of a change. And again, if you're 10 years old today, you will never know that just a few years earlier, there was this kind of big forested area. So again, how do you deal with that shifting baseline, what's called the extinction of experience? I think too far-fetched to say this is in the 1800s, right? But this is Tanjung Katong. Maybe that's a little bit too much of a change. But there are people who remember that East Coast, maybe some of you. This is Budok, and if you look at that vast, I remember saying, to Prof. Leo Tan about Tanjung Chekjawa on the eastern point of Pulau Ubin, what a beautiful intertidal. He said, that's nothing. You should have seen the East Coast in the 1960s. I mean, you just walk out forever. And then the fishing villages, it must have been, again, I mean, what we got in return was, of course, a lot of land, which allowed a lot of development, a lot of people, new opportunities. But of course, there's an ecological flip side to that. So this is the 19-hectare experimental reclamation. And there were lots of hills on the East Coast that were used to fill in this shallow intertidal zone. And, quite considerable area, 1970-something HDB diagram. Yeah, this is the Tanjung Katong seaside. So, and by the way, katong either refers to a turtle, sea turtle, or a tree. I'd like to think it's a tree, the katong, which is a member of the bean family. But anyway, to think that, oh, and we have structures too. So let me draw your attention to this Naller Road back here. And you can still see this. You can still see this old seawall. Of course, it's been developed quite a bit, so the seawall is now behind the walkway to an MRT station, but it's still there for anyone who cares to look and experience that heritage. This is a 1945 map, 1945. And look at the legend here: Nipa palm, lalang, padi, pineapple. In 1945, not that long ago. Of course, I was born after 1945, but my parents would have been, you know, my parents' generation would have been teenagers then, and you could still see this as part of the landscape. So that's what I mean by kind of this shifting baseline or extinction of experience. And this study by a leader in this field of perception just shows that, you know, with each generation, they seem to remember having lost more fish, there are fewer trees in the area, there are fewer birds. And as you might expect, the younger groups don't really seem to have noticed much climate change compared to somebody who's lived through the many decades. And again, if we're coming up with policy, trying to get people to change the way we do things, if we are lacking that experience, that reference point, it really is a little bit difficult, I think, because we lose that experience. Okay, so now to talk about biophilia. This is a really wonderful thing. It just shows, it basically is a theory that says because humans we grew up in nature, right? We were hunters and gatherers, and so many of these experiences have been hardwired into our systems, and so we have a natural affinity for nature. I think that's the crux of the biophilia argument, and we are a biophilic city, and we have people like Dr. Lena Chan to thank for tirelessly pursuing this idea of a biophilic city. There's another interesting thing, though, which is that biophilia has an evil twin, or the flip side is called biophobia. There are some people with a genuine, it's not like people who don't like crows or koalas because they're noisy. I mean, this is people who really fear, for some reason, nature. And I think, maybe there are a few people, not many, but a few who maybe didn't bargain for a city in nature. Nature can be out there, thank you very much. And so I think our challenge there is, how do we sensitively deal with people, right? And there are a few, maybe in the few thousands, but how do we create opportunities to break that cycle, that vicious cycle of biophobia, and then to turn it into a more positive experience? So I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all. Nature is great. Just look at it, you'll fall in love. There are a number of people out there who really don't see it that way, and I think we need to be sensitive to the way they see things. So I might like seeing a hornet, not up close, but I might love a snake from a distance, or certainly an earthworm to feel it, but not everybody does. And I think a study by my colleague Ngo Kang Min, right? So this is the vicious cycle of biophobia. You have a bad idea, you have an encounter, it gets worse, and it just gets, it's terrible. It just spirals downward from there. A local study by our colleague Ngo Kang Min found that, again, the childhood nature experiences goes a long way to shaping our attitudes. And it's not like you need to have pets or go bird watching. Apparently, it could be something as simple as having your own garden, just feeling soil, being out in the fresh air. You don't have to be like a Dr. Dolittle or anything like that. It just is a simple exposure to just the outdoors can be enough to break that cycle, according to the people who study it. And the benefits are many. The benefits are many. And I'll do that in a second. So now just a few minutes. What can we do to make biodiversity even more thriving and to derive even more joy from it. That's a tall order to say that. I mean, we have incredibly clever people working for years, and well, I mean, trying to do this in 10 minutes. Okay, I'm going to try. I think there are a few things we do, in Singapore we're doing very well. And I think we can even, if we coordinate across sectors, I think we can do even better. All right, so we're not doing anything poorly. I think as well as we're doing, we can always nudge a little bit further. So based on what I have seen over these past few decades, here are some of the things I've noticed. So one of them would be this idea of these little fragments. So the reality is that some of these are losing gradually, sometimes not so gradually, their diversity. So that might be something that we could quickly try to remedy by just kind of reinforcing these a little bit earlier rather than waiting for these tall giant trees to collapse, and then you start from literally from square one again. We also, I think, have to live with the reality that we will continue to lose some species. This, for example, when I came to Singapore 35 years ago, scarlet minivet, we could still see it. Now we can't. I think it really is gone. This cream-colored giant squirrel, my colleague, Professor Peter Ng, had a pet cream-colored giant squirrel in the 1960s. This species probably disappeared about 30 years ago. I think we will continue to lose a few species. That's just the reality of when habitats get smaller. So then the question really, the challenge then is to find which are the ones that are most vulnerable. Can anything be done? And the other thing is not to just think of the individual species, but how do the little forest patches, these little ecosystems function, and can we maintain their resilience and their functionality? I guess that would be the challenge there. We can do probably across different sectors, whether it be horticultural, whether live pet trade. How can we screen some? So this brown anole, I don't know how it came, but it was first discovered at a major botanical attraction that sits on formerly reclaimed land at the south of the island. And perhaps, Ing Tong, was this also from the same area, or the greenhouse frog? Okay, so again, it's nobody's fault. It's just that so many plants are coming in, and there might be eggs and things inside the the horticultural. So what some countries do is maybe hold these things in quarantine, let whatever is going to come out, and then maybe deal with it, and then use the plant. So again, I'm no expert at this, but I think there are ways maybe we can tighten up some of the screening. Luckily, we've not had our ecosystems inundated with invasive species too badly, but better to do be a bit cautious on this one. Now, there's something I wanted to spend a few minutes on. I call this the curious case of the positive shifting baseline. So look at this mothership saying this is the most important unprotected patch of forest in Singapore. And it's beautiful. It's really beautiful. And I think one of our colleagues, Bryce Lee, had this drone footage of it. It was wonderful and viral. But I think a tree like this might have been, if I was in secondary one, that tree could be the same age as me. This is the world's fastest growing tropical tree. It really is like an instant tall tree. Just add water, literally. I mean, and it just takes off. 5 meters a year it can grow. But that's been a wonderful thing in the sense because what might have been, say, wasteland today, 5 years hence, looks like this great ancient forest. So it is actually this, Biophilia has done a lot to shift public opinion about forests because these areas don't remain as wasteland, they turn green. And then the moment they're cleared for development, people feel the pain and they react to it. So I think this has been very interesting. The other thing is that because they grow so quickly and our native trees do not reach that size, so they take decades, whereas these can do it within a decade, they become a target. This is Singapore General Hospital. This little patch of trees, maybe 10, 15 years old, just blew in. The wind blew these seeds, pods in. And then they started taking off because nobody was cutting the grass. And because they're instant tall tree, right up in there, the eagle's nest. So they actually are extremely important for biodiversity too, because they provide the kind of habitat that's so lacking, which are these really tall old trees. Now they're also dangerous if they're near property, because they break very easily, because they grow so quickly, so they're very brittle wood. But in places where maybe there's not so much property, or there's not a lot of foot traffic, perhaps this could be a viable way of creating the kind of habitat we need to at least be kind of an interim, housing these wildlife until we can restore the forest to, what they might have been 200 years ago. Okay, anything else? Remember COVID? That was an interesting thing too. How in my neighborhood, grandparents were taking their grandchildren to look at all the butterflies and the bees that were coming because, well, we had to stay indoors, and that applied to the grass cutters also. So all of a sudden, you had this tall grass, lots of wildflowers, butterflies, moths. It was beautiful. Now, I'm not saying we don't cut grass again, but it might be possible, for example, to maybe do a rotation. So maybe every 4 weeks or 5 weeks or whatever you experimentally determine to be kind of an optimal, let the grass and flowers come and bring the insects, and then you cut that, but in the meantime, you sort of stagger the cutting, so at any one time you have different stages of flower development, and so that would bring a lot more color and life to neighborhoods, be a chance for people to bond with their children and grandchildren. It could be quite wonderful. Another thing, this is David Tan, and his research was looking at what causes these birds to slam into glass windows so much. Interestingly, he found that there was a very high correlation between blue light and migratory bird collision. So blue light would attract them, or they tend to be this relationship. LEDs are a very efficient form of lighting, but they also tend to have a high blue component. So again, this is something that maybe needs to be looked at. But one of the interesting things is, I don't know if you would fancy walking around literally in a red light district, but this is apparently very wildlife friendly. It doesn't distract bats and other nocturnal wildlife. Now, I'm not saying we just change every light to a red one, but we could maybe figure out, are there certain areas that have a lot of these nocturnal animals, and maybe experimentally try putting in the red light to see, first of all, you can't just put them in overnight and you expect the public to revel in it. But you could maybe over a series of engagements maybe people will want to try to be the first to try these wildlife-friendly lighting options. Okay, there's a couple of other things. We have a great scientific community. I know Dr. Lena Chan about 15 years ago tried to gather all the biodiversity people and say, can we do these things together? And the community being what it is, we never have been able to really coordinate our actions. And I think it's a good chance to try it again. Try what Dr. Lena Chan had done 15 years ago and bring in the different sectors, work together rather than kind of stay in maybe this across many fields, rather than staying in silos, we can work together. And again, update some of the science. So for example, I caught this one. Do you see one of the things that prescribes a plant native nitrogen fix? Basically, these are bean and other related plants that have bacteria in their roots that essentially enrich the soil with organic nitrogen. And that's a very widely used technique. It turns out, though, in tropical Asian forests, it's not nitrogen that holds forests back. It's phosphorus. So even if you plant the nitrogen-fixing plants, it's arguable how much benefit is derived from that. The other thing is we're industrial. There's a lot of nitrogen in the air floating around that settles in the forest. So this what's called nitrogen deposition is very high, too. So maybe what we don't need are these nitrogen-fixing. We might need another approach. We can do this through experimentation. Okay, use the genetics. So this is, all these dots just mean this is the movement of wildlife, their interactions. This is Prof. Frank Reint at NUS. So this short-tailed babbler, this is an unbelievable outcome. So there's the central catchment area. Maybe the map on the left is clearer. Oops, sorry. This half is separated from this half. No bird from this southern part of the catchment flies up to the north, and nothing from the north flies to the south. This is a bird that requires a continuous canopy. They don't like to go in open areas. So even this little 10, few meters of open space prevents them from going this way and this way. And so you have these two totally isolated populations that will basically inbreed their way to extinction if we don't do, what could possibly inbreed their way to extinction if we don't really address this. And it might be quite a quick fix. I mean, I don't know if that'd be our colleagues at NParks be catching these birds and then bring them to the other side of the forest. I don't think it'd be anything like that. But again, at least the science suggests that there is something, that can prescribe a solution. So I think we can take better care of the science. This is another one. This is these tall trees, compass. Honeybees carry the pollen, the giant honeybees from Bukit all the way to the botanic gardens. They were able to find this from genetic experiments. And honeybees were moving back in the giant honeybees between Bukit and McRitchie carrying pollen. And from McRitchie to the botanic gardens. This means that it might be difficult for animals to kind of move across the landscape, like wildlife, but plant life can be through this kind of series of stepping stones. The pollinators can move between them. So essentially, Singapore could become one big giant rainforest mediated by pollinators that are flying across the landscape, at least for some species. And I think that's something we could explore too. I'll skip this one, but this question of, we sometimes are averse to bringing in plants from Malaysia because of a fear that they might, I won't use the word pollute, but impurities to the genetic makeup of our local populations. I'm not sure if the science completely supports that. And so that, again, that's another thing. We have a really good genetics community. We can leverage on their expertise because if we can bring in Malaysian germplasm plants from at least the southern part of Johor, that could very quickly help us restore these forests. If that can be done without negative impacts, and I think it can. Clearly, the genetics on the Raffles banded langur, one of our most iconic species, shows that our populations are highly inbred. They need to be infused with a little more genetic diversity. I'm not suggesting we go and catch and kidnap banded langurs, but we need to do something at a regional level. Yeah, and that's a policy. Here's what's been done in Germany. They've taken endangered plants and put them into gardens and parks and revive these populations. There's no reason why we couldn't be doing the same in a systematic method. Imagine if each town council adopted its own rare native plant. There are 100 town councils, we have 100 species we could bring back from the brink of extinction just from planting it kind of in the landscape. Or we could plant them in these places that are unusable, like these little traffic circles. We have a little mini forest in there of native plants that are pollinating each other and creating more seeds that we can then use for our reforestation efforts elsewhere. So there's a lot of things that we can do. Plant Parkia patai. The bats are flying all over the island at night, pollinating these plants. Again, they go, this one I think is the Stamford Road. This is SMU. And these plants have come out of the rainforest to go down Bras Basah to go drink this nectar. It's pretty amazing. And again, if we could then, on these little fun facts about wildlife, go from trivia to actually application, I think it could be really wonderful. Okay, so I'm going to then now, oh, by the way, my colleague Melissa Ong, sitting in the middle, is building bee gardens. And this is an example where a planted landscape might be able to actually support the wild forest by maybe, cultivating your little armies of pollinators in the city. And then when it's time to move into the forest to pollinate those natural ecosystems, they can do. You just use the urban landscape to support the wild species. Okay, last couple things. And yeah, this is so cute. Okay, we're doing a good job on trying to clamp down on the illegal, but this is heartbreaking, right? To see 9 tons of elephant tusk, 300 elephants killed for this illegal trade, or 12 tons of pangolin scales representing 2,000 pangolins, and who knows, maybe this is just the tip of the iceberg. So again, I think this is somewhere where, which I'll touch on lecture 3, where as an international community, I think we can do an even better job of trying to, these are dangerous and not easy problems to solve, but I think we can get there. Last thing I wanted to say, and this is some ecology, just saying that you can go from coral reef habitat, if you mismanage it, it could turn into seaweeds and it doesn't go back the other way. Or if you start with a forest, and this is, coral bleaching due to global, or you can do what are called tipping points. So you can have the Amazon, which is like this, forest that vast, but with global warming and some forest fires, you could actually push that whole Amazon forest. It's not inconceivable that all these great forest systems could turn into grasslands if we don't really watch these tipping points. So there are these things that we can do as a research community, as a policy community, to deal with these really, really terrible issues. Okay, so I'm going to go really to the last couple of slides just to show, many studies have shown many benefits for nature: cognitive benefits, general wellness benefits, disease, recovery from injury. Just by spending a little bit of time in nature, you don't have to be a biologist. And this is what I'll talk more at length next month when we talk about the social good of nature. And you can buy this book, Good Nature by Prof. Kathy Willis. She's combed through all the studies for us. Now, again, what is the biggest problem to, I think, becoming a city in nature? And I think it's us, probably. I think it's some of these attitudes. We'll talk about this with Audrey, but, these macaque sightings and people, getting all distraught. Maybe there's some little fixes that we could, or how about this cicada that came up last week? Look at this poor resident. She was frightened to death. They were swatting them. They were hiding under shelter. And I do have some recordings of cicadas. But if you go to other places, they're the sign of summer. They're a reminder of the impermanence of life. They are very important to many of our cultures. That's the tsukutsuku hoshi cicada from Japan, the third of the native cicadas, the last. Okay, now you can be quiet now. Okay. All right. So that is, it's a happy association to hear that, and yet, we kind of yangate shinu keshiki wa miezu semi no koe. So poets like Matsuo Basho have been writing about these things. They're celebrated in Chinese culture. They're in art, they're in fans, jade pieces 3,000 years old. They're, again, respected. They tell a lot of lessons. They talk about things. They're even involved in war strategies. So anyway, they're an enduring symbol of transformation and regeneration. So what I'm going to say, I think we need to fundamentally adjust our relationship with nature. It's not just the science can get us pretty far, but the science will not get us out of the biodiversity crisis. I think it's a change from within. That is not so easily changed through policy. It's a real challenge. So I mean, do these people really experience a meaningful relationship with nature? Maybe they do, but I think perhaps it could be even enriched further. Do these guys who disturb these poor bird nests, are they really meaningfully engaging with nature? Maybe these people who take a Airbus like a turtle feel that bond. And here, this school in Taiwan takes its children out every Friday for a field trip. Every Friday. I want to thank Charmaine and Kai-Sin because they made me find photos of myself. I didn't even know these existed. My sister found them. And I'd forgotten about all of these things. But neither of my parents are educated beyond secondary school. But they like being outdoors. And what I did notice, and thanks again, Kai-Sin and Charmaine, they took me out. I didn't realize I was, feeding animals at the zoo. I love the zoo. I'd be arrested in Singapore if I was feeding pigeons. I played with beetles. I stuck some on my younger sister. I kept all kinds of pets. That's censored, by the way. Okay. But I do think that it's really important to experience this world. And how do you give people experiences who maybe are not in a situation where they can easily be brought out to nature? And I think that's a big social policy that we can work on. We need magic in this world, and nature can provide that magic. A world without magic is maybe not a world worth living in. And so I think I'll end on that note, and thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you, Dr. Lam. For those watching the lecture on Facebook, please submit your comments and questions through the Facebook comment box. For our audience members here, please step up to the mic to ask your questions. May I now invite Ms. Audrey Tan, Assistant News Editor at the Straits Times, to start the Q&A session.
So thank you so much, Shawn, for that really interesting lecture with all the history and science. And I hope that many of you here can appreciate, how interesting it is that, we are all gathered here to talk about nature and the magic it can bring us amid these really trying times. So we have about 30 minutes for Q&A. And while you guys rev up your engines, I would maybe start by asking Shawn a little bit more about, all the headlines that you have shown us about the crows and the cicadas. And all the other negative examples of human-wildlife interactions with wild boars. They are also happening at the same time as we are touting Singapore City in Nature Drive. And also some interesting developments that are positive. For example, the peregrine falcons nesting in OCBC. Many people are interested in the live cam that NParks recently put up. So how would you kind of reconcile this for people, for policymakers? How can we enjoy the benefits of being a city in nature, and how should we treat these amenities?
Very good question, Audrey. So I think, I don't have all the answers, obviously, but I think one thing is I feel that if these are wonderful things, these creatures all around us. I mean, of course, some, like a dengue-carrying Aedes mosquito, maybe be less excited about, and I feel kind of bad that it's not through anything, any skill on my part, but I just had the luxury, really the blessing of being raised by a family who took me out a lot. And I grew up not afraid of some of these things. And I feel like if everybody had that opportunity, lives would be enriched. People really would have a reason to look forward to seeing something exciting every day. How much better can things get than that? So, but that's a really difficult one. How do you create the opportunities for people to, have nature there, but you can be exposed to it gradually, not in your face in a kind of overwhelming way? So I think that's a spatial thing. That's probably how we design our cities. There's probably an outreach and education component. There's probably also, I'm sure there could be a lot of people who might be role models within our community just to introduce us to this. I understand parents are busy. They don't have the time, like maybe my parents did, to take me out. So how can you then provide those opportunities? And I think it's a social challenge as well as a scientific and infrastructural one.
You can't enjoy the butterflies without first enduring the caterpillars, right?
That's true, but I was once shocked. I went to the fragile forest at the zoo, which has butterflies flying around, and I saw children who were petrified of butterflies. I'd never experienced that before, to see people absolutely frightened out of their wits by butterflies, and that surprised me. And I felt kind of bad. I felt bad for those kids, because rather than deriving joy, they've experienced fear. I don't want that. Wish that on anybody.
So under the NParks City Nature Vision, other than doing the forest restoration and all of those activities, one of the pillars is also about improving awareness among Singaporeans for the benefits of biodiversity. So how would you explain to policymakers here what are some of the key turning points in Singapore's history that has, kind of been like a turning point in how society approaches nature?
So it's an interesting thing, I think, and some of you in this audience are more expert than I am, but I think the last 10 years have seen an explosion of young people who are really, really good at natural history. They know their plants, know their animals, but at the same time, I have a fear that there's also an equal number who have grown even further and further away from nature. We live in our kind of digital world. And that, I think, is really unfortunate. So I would think that one of the things we need to think about is, so we can technically create a city in nature. We plant more plants, we connect nature areas. We can do that. The science is there. I think we have the infrastructural capacity to do it. But I think maybe more fundamentally, what is a city in nature? What are the values that come with being a city in nature? What does it mean to us? So I think we've dealt with the technical parts of it very well, but I think to ask, what does it say about us as individuals, as a community, as a country, to be a city in nature? I think that's something that we need to do. I'll talk about this in the next lecture, but I did have a slide there about, the Maintenance of Parents Act. The law is not meant to replace filial piety. It's really there to be a backstop. In the same way, I think a love for nature cannot be legislated, but we have to let it kind of grow. And maybe the legislation and the rules and the fines really are the biodiversity equivalent of the maintenance of parents. It's really the backstop. Yeah.
I mean, at this point, I would like to invite members of the audience, if you are interested in asking Shawn any questions, please head to the mics near you, and we'll take questions in groups of 3. So maybe over to you. Please introduce yourself and your name before your question. Thank you.
Sure. I'm Richard Hartung. The question is, there's a debate between whether it's all policymakers or whether individuals can make a difference. What would you like to have as the 2 or 3 takeaways of what we should do to help promote biodiversity in Singapore?
Thank you. Maybe we'll take that question first. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your profound insight and wisdom. My name is Patrick. I have 2 quick questions. How do you define and quantify the economic value of biodiversity? And second question is, if you were the new Minister for Sustainability and Environment, what key message would you like to share with us now? Thank you so much.
Sure. So first to Richard, 2 or 3 takeaways. I feel like how do we find? This is something interesting that I'd like to try to expand a little bit more in the next talk. But often what we do is say, well, let's just put in the school syllabus, and that should make things a lot better. And I do think that's part of it, but I don't think we can let the school take over the primary job of giving children these wonderful experiences. So I think, again, across society as a whole, how do we allow people not just to appreciate, but overcome a fear, sometimes a crippling fear of nature, which shouldn't be like that. I mean, another thing would be, I think we don't have enough stories, I think, about nature. We're really good on the technical, sciencey bits of it, but where are our own mythologies? We surveyed some nieces yesterday. I mean, very unscientific study, but we asked, tell us what you learned about, Sang Kanshil, those stories of the wise mouse deer, and they'd never heard of it. I was flabbergasted because my wife Eve tells me that you had to study thick tomes. No, I'm just joking, but they were exposed to it. So I think that's those stories I think are very important. So nature is more than just the biodiversity. And to your question, Patrick, I think there is an economic element of nature, obviously, and some people like Professor Houston Kwa do it in a literal way. If you had a view, how much more would you be willing to pay for a flat? Right? If you had heard birdsong, what would you put a price on that? So that's the pricing of nature. But I think another approach now actually says, what are the value of the services nature provides for us? Cleansing water, cleaning our air, reducing the load on an air conditioning system because it's cooling. But I even think that system doesn't quite that's the dollars and cents, and I think it's really important. But I think that has to be also addressed. And going back to your question, Richard, I think that has to, I don't know how to do it, but how do you not only change people's understanding, but to the point where you can actually take action, right? And it's been, I think some of your colleagues wrote about it, Audrey, where...
Ting, she's in the audience.
Oh, yes. Youth, I think, are more aware, but maybe less likely to take action than somebody of my age, the boomer generation. But again, that's just, these are cultural things. Cultural things can be shifted and nudged. Yeah.
What about his second question? If you were the Minister for Sustainability and the Environment, what is your message? But actually in Singapore, the nature conservation falls under the Ministry of National Development. So if you were the Minister for National Development, what would your main message be?
Well, I thought the previous chap was pretty good, But you see, the thing with Minister Desmond Lee was, I think he was very clever. I mean, but he actually had he developed over time a genuine interest. He had a feeling for it, which wasn't part of his, job scope, but he actually did. And I think that closeness and his desire, really, his enthusiasm to allow others to experience that made him extremely sympathetic. I think if you talk to anybody in the nature community, they agree. So I think, it's really hard. It's sometimes, I'm a teacher too, so you teach facts, you teach concepts, you want to teach them to do well in the exam. I mean, the most eminent professor in Singapore is up in the front row here. You can do all of that, but in the end, is that what's the most important? To get, you want those little bits of knowledge to come alive and to inspire you and make your imagination, dream things. And I think that can not necessarily translate into very concrete, easily defined policy, but at the same time, I think it's important to make that a goal or objective. I don't know what you think, Aaron, or any other view in the audience, but I think that's pretty elusive, but I think it's really fundamental somehow.
Yeah, I think one of the more memorable policy developments under Desmond Lee's tenure was when, the Dover Forest, he kind of divided it. So the whole area is zoned for housing, but he decided to develop the one half for housing first and leave the second half, which is the more biodiverse half, for future generations to decide what they want to do with the land. So I think that was pretty unprecedented, right?
Yeah, it was. And I think in our audience, we have Carl Peng, who at the time was an undergraduate, and he was very vocal in kind of leading this youth brigade to Singapore Youth Voices for Biodiversity to appeal. And their voices were heard. I mean, the voice of the entire nature community. But it was wonderful to see that the young guys really care. And yeah.
I see a few of your faces here. But yes, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Shawn. I am Nathan. I was born in 55, so I'm 70 now. I was in the education service. I studied here in Bukit Timah campus. At that point, 77 to 80, this was the only campus we had, and we went through three names. University of Singapore Joint Campus and National University of Singapore. Professor Leotan was at that time a fresh PhD lecturer. He took us through the botany and zoology and so on. Now when I come back to this campus, I see that the greenery is so much enhanced compared to when we were students, right? The concrete part remains the same. But what I'm trying to share with you is, while you have highlighted the part where we have destroyed the nature, but there's a lot of significant portion of Singapore where the government, together with the NGOs, is doing a lot quietly to enhance the nature. So this is one example, Bukit Timah campus. Then you would take NUS today, Professor Sivadodi and team. the 1 million tree movement, I mean, I'm part of their team. They're not only taking care of the NUS campus itself, but they're also taking care of the railway corridor, right? Then if you look at the St. John's Island, today it is connected with 4 other islands. I think the government is trying to use that place to try to get back the corals which we lost during the early development period. So I hope in the next 2 lectures, you also highlight this part of Singapore, whereby while we have destroyed many of the species and we have lost many of the species, we are also enhancing in different ways. In fact, Sir Stamford Raffles started the botanical gardens, right? But very few people talk about, we always talk about 1965, we started planting trees. But actually, if you go back at 1890, when Sir Stamford Raffles, he himself was a very nature person and his team was, and they also did contributions. So I hope in your final lecture, you will then bring together and say, okay, positive 60%, maybe negative 40%, we are in the right direction, right?
I'm going to take notes on that one, Mr. Nathan. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, we can take one question there and then one here. We'll take 3 questions at a time. Hope you don't know. Yeah, so we go there first and then we'll come to you.
Thank you, Audrey. Thank you, Shawn. It's a blessing to be here to witness your passion for nature. Yeah, such a blessing to finally hear somebody in IPS, talk so passionately about working with different people, giving credit to different people, that together we can build a biodiverse Singapore. So from Potter, Singapore, where we start importing plants from other countries, we have become a poorer society, as you have concretely demonstrated. We have forgotten what was once vernacular to now what is forgotten and foreign to us. It is really a very sad Singapore today. So while Audrey thinks that it's unprecedented for a 50-50 solution in Dover, right? I have actually been going to Dover area and the canal, the Ulu Pandan Canal, to witness many, many biodiverse creations that we have lost today permanently. Yeah, so while you may say that, it's unprecedented, we have forgotten also to report on what we have lost. So then how do we then document and encourage our media, which is supposed to be trusted, according to Josephine Teo, and has a 90% reach, although, the reach of 90% may not mean that people are actually reading the information, reading the media, and it is not trusted because rubbish has got 100% reach, but yet it's not consumable, right? So yeah, it is not palatable, it is toxic. So then how do we move from a culture of appreciation to a culture of cancellation, a culture of demolition? Thank you, Dr. Shawn.
Thank you. And then we'll take one question from...
Yes, good afternoon, Dr. Shawn. Long time no see, since 2006. Now, my name is W2. I speak from the perspective of Singapore and West Johor. Now, what is interesting is we have a lot of regular pruning of the trees in our society. And upon my queries with these contractors, most of this wood are being disposed of. And upon my physical inspection and touching of the wood, this feel like very good quality compass wood, which can be repurposed. Now, we have spent a lot of money on contracting out the gardening, landscaping aspects of our island. However, since 65 till today, unfortunately, I don't find many incumbent citizens motivated enough to take ownership, step out of their homes, and to tinker with the plants in front of their homes. So, by trying to think out of the box, what do you think about this concept whereby we give ownership to the islanders of Singapore to take ownership of the green spaces, however big or little it is, outside their respective dwellings, and to just simply plant. Most of our flora, fauna in this island appears more for cosmetic purposes, but our fundamental need for nutrition appears to be, how shall I say, overridden by cosmetic reasons. So I see a lot of potential if, say, somebody out there has the personality to motivate the nation to just simply start planting fruits that can be edible so that we don't have to waste so much money giving out grants to vertical farming companies that fail, for example. And my last point is, have we looked into the problem of sea debris that clutters up our shorelines? I have roamed around the Jurong Island extension, Sentosa embankments, and whenever there is a low tide, we collect a lot of sea debris. And yes, there are social groups, youngsters, who go out and do beach cleaning, but on a realistic, practical reason, I don't think we're solving the problem at all. So these are the concerns which I would like to share with Dr. Shawn and to the audience here, who would probably have better ideas to find solutions. Thank you.
Thank you. So, I mean, since we only have 10 minutes left and we have two, shall we just take all the questions and then you can answer them all in one go?
And then I'll make a comment there too. Yes, please.
Okay. Okay. So we will go from the back and then to Lena and then here, and then we'll run off here and then no more questions because Dr. Shawn will answer all 6.
Okay.
But we have written it down. So.
Hi, Dr. Shawn. I'm hoping you'll comment on Singapore's AI policy, because right now it feels like in a lot of programs like SG60, Heart and Soul, Singapore is projecting this aim to have a future which is very much in line with the idea of a city in nature and all this greenwashing, but not arguing, but sort of hand-waving away the fact that right now data centers are extremely environmentally costly.
Thank you. Lena?
Can you hear me? I'm not to use technology, you can hear me.
I think because we have people tuning in online, so it helps if you...
Testing. Is it working? Mic test. Yeah, okay. I've got quite a few comments, but just one suggestion, Shawn. You were talking about how to actually deal with a bigger problem, getting people interested, linked with nature. I thought one very important thing is to incorporate biodiversity in all levels of the curriculum, right from preschool to primary school, secondary school, even up to university level. I think we tried, but it should be done in a much more, I won't say aggressive, but more widespread way, especially with Mr. Desmond Lee as the Minister of Education and Kenneth as the PS of Education. Maybe we can push that further. School curriculum, incorporate biodiversity into school curriculum, and which means that everybody must have a chance to actually interact with biodiversity. And the other important thing is we already have a policy. Every resident by 2030 must should be within 400 meters or 10 minutes walk from a park. What better way to actually experience biodiversity? Yeah, hope that would help. Yeah,
Thanks,
we'll
Lena.
take it offline, all the other issues.
And the final question?
Yes, I'm Yok Ling. I am an LKYSPP alum. Right, so I will just keep my questions short. So basically, I wanted to ask about the native species. I know that they, due to whatever reason, sometimes there will be species that are introduced into our environment that may, pose a threat to the native species here in the environment. So how can we, prevent that from happening, or how can we control that, or how can we allow that to happen in, in a ring-fenced manner, so that we can have more biodiversity and just, live with other new species being introduced? That is one question. The other question is that I also know that the other question, I just lost my train of thought, but I remember reading about like entire lakes being drained because GAR was present in the lakes, and then you have to, go to a great extent to, remove this kind of threats to the environment. And of course, the other, okay, my thought just came back. So the other thing is that we have people wanting to buy landed property or condos with views of nature, birds and the bees and whatever not, but then you have like monkeys going into their condos or their landed property to grab food and things like that. So the thing is that if you want to have the views, you want to be close to nature, you also have to be embracing all these things that come along with it. So that's my take on it, and how is your response to it as well? Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks so much. Okay, Shawn, you have 5 minutes to answer 6 questions.
Oh, I thought we were taking a dinner break and come back to answer the questions. These are really great points. I think for each of them, I think there's no one prescription. I guess it's like many things that are important. You have to really, in my opinion, come at them from different angles. So take for example your point earlier about the landscape. Yes, we can use it in ways that maybe promote contact with nature, that might be small but nonetheless visible elements of food security, that we don't have to put everything into high-tech agri-park, but maybe citizens can do a small part and in the process feel connected. Maybe there is something like that. In the case of, say, invasive species, it's some of it's regulation in the control of imports. Some of it is our behavioral. How can you be a responsible pet owner, for example, or don't buy things on impulse and then end up releasing it into the nature reserve, right? So it's some of those things. Luckily, our tropical habitats are remarkably resilient, even though they're really tiny. We've been fairly lucky, although there are a number of animal species that have been proliferating. And in Singapore, we've been a little bit, in the past at least anyway, we just didn't have the capacity to deal with that quickly enough. Now that we do have a larger team, for example, in the wildlife branch, can we mobilize and use other sectors, whether they're citizens, whether they be the NGOs like Acres or Our Wild Neighbors, and then together cooperatively deal with some of these issues. And we do have a really good animal welfare sector. Again, Acres, Our Wild Neighbors, the Monday Wildlife team and everything.
What about the question on, Singapore's AI policy? That came up a lot in the budget debates.
Yeah.
And how do you reconcile this and, the energy, water guzzling nature of data centers with our push to be sustainable, to help with biodiversity and also with climate change?
Yeah, that's a good point, RJ. I mean, you're more the expert than I on this, but I think AI is, it's a big part of education. It makes me as a teacher it's very challenging when the students have access to all these tools that I know very little about. But no, I think it does confer great benefits, but I think there still needs to be a kind of a wisdom and a compassion in its usage, compassion for others, compassion for the environment. There needs to be some sort of, hopefully some social equitability involved in the benefits that accrue from some of these wonderful transformative technology. And again, it might have a heavy load on the environment, but can we then quickly enough develop some of these more renewable approaches or energy-saving approaches to? So I think it's a great challenge. The expert is sitting right next to me, but But yes, I do think even something like renewable energy, right? It sounds like this unlimited supply of free energy, but it's not free. It comes at cost. You know, solar farms use a lot of land that could otherwise support ecosystems, for example, right? So again, how do we balance? How do we balance? How do we spread the benefits? And how do we remember that these are things that we really need to use wisely, with foresight, and with care for each other and with care for the environment.
And I guess with two more questions is, firstly, how do you account or document what we have lost, in terms of all the extinctions that have happened in Singapore? And secondly, how do we encourage residents to take ownership of our green spaces?
I mean, there's some, on the latter, I think there's some very, very promising, both from, for example, national parks run a lot of outreach efforts, take part in documenting the biodiversity in your neighborhood. One of the groups that I volunteer with, the Nature Society, has a program called Every Singaporean a Naturalist, in which encourages people to experience the environment. Another group that I work with, Jane Goodall Institute, has this wonderful program called Roots and Shoots. Do something for your community, do something for animals, wildlife, do something for the environment. I mean, and come up with your own ideas. Another group that I work with called Arosha Singapore. It's a conservation group, Christian-based, and imagine if in faith communities, hundreds and millions in Singapore, if we could align people's faith with caring for not just each other or going to a better place when we leave this one, but taking care of things right here, right now, we could make a huge difference. So I think there's, from all sectors of the community, we can do a lot. Schools can do a lot. I agree with you, Lena, that it should be infused more, but I think it can't be just prescriptive, but in a way that allows people to approach this and have pleasant memories and positive associations. And again, I didn't realize all those happy moments in my own childhood, which I had long forgotten, seeing these photographs. And it was just through these chance, spontaneous, unstructured encounters, together with, I guess, the more formal curriculum of schools that, I mean, one of my greatest joys really would be following my mentor, Prof. Leo Tan, on one of his intertidal walks. I mean, picking up things, I mean, just that enthusiasm. I thought, one day I want to be like that and get people really excited about nature in that same way. So I think a combination, but I think, again, we work together as a community. It's not just the nature people, but it's everybody.
Thanks, Shawn. And I guess that's a good note to end off on. I mean, the timer is blinking at me here. But, I mean, this is just the first of Shawn's 3 lectures. So hopefully, if you have more questions, some of his subsequent lectures will help to answer some of the other burning questions that you have. But thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. And I just want to thank all of you for coming here. Audrey had a meeting, and which she rescheduled, just to be able to moderate this session. I'm truly grateful. And again, to all of you for spending the afternoon with us. Thank you, Kai-Sin and Charmaine and everyone at IPS for making this possible. What an honor.
Thank you, Dr. Lam.
We've come to the end of today's lecture. We would like to hear your views on the event. Please click our link on the Facebook feed or scan the QR code on the screen to submit your feedback. Dr. Shawn Lam's second lecture will take place on 13 April. Details will be on our website and IPS Facebook page. We hope to see you then. Thank you.